Hello and welcome to In Conversation with the history holders of the American Dance Therapy Association, a project made possible by the Marian Chace Foundation. My name is Dr. Jacelyn Biondo. When I first conceived of making these videos, I hoped to capture the words of the women who studied with the firsts in our field: Marian Chase, Trudy Shoup, Mary Whitehouse, Alma Hawkins, Blanche Evan, and Lillian Espinack. What culminated in the process was an opportunity to have these women share their stories and their memories in their own words, and to capture these parts of history for future generations. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy our conversations. I'm so happy to be joined today by Dr. Janet Adler. Janet, thank you so much for coming to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So to start us off, if you could share a little bit about with whom and where you first began studying dance therapy.
That's a wonderful question, because I don't know if my colleagues would say the same thing, but there wasn't dance therapy when I began wandering around dancing with children with autism or health issues, mental health issues, physical health issues. So I wanted to be with children. This sounds a little silly to summarize it this way, but it's completely clear. I wanted to be with children who were suffering, who were challenged, who were off center and not okay because of that. So I remembered I had a little blue record player and I had a drum, and I would just go to mental hospitals and really knock on the door. And I think I was innocuous. I was just some young, very young girl, really, saying, "Can I dance with the children?" And of course, there's no reason to say no. So that's kind of how it started. And I think my connection to mental health was because my maternal grandmother suffered from psychosis her whole adult life. So my mother used to take me with her every other weekend, to the mental hospital to be with my grandmother, and I adored her. And I was very interested in people who were struggling with mental health issues. I think that's why, and I was young and I loved children, so I think that's kind of how it began. And then actually my mother sent me a newspaper article about Marian Chase in the year that a few years, but when I first arrived in Washington, D.C. And so I went to Marian in the same way and said, "Can I work with you?" And we had I remember we had a lovely meeting. I don't remember it visually, but I remember the feeling of it. And the next thing I knew, I was running after her in these back wards. My job was to put the records on and take them off. And I was stunned by what she was doing. It seemed like completely magical. These people so desperately ill and inaccessible to another and to themselves. And she would come in and kind of go like this. And suddenly there's a circle of us dancing and shouting and turning. It was extraordinary. And then the clock said we had to go and take the record player off and rush out the door. And I remember all these keys. We were in the back wards. And it was, of course, a very impactful experience. So Marian called herself a dance therapist. And at some point, I don't know when, and that's when I thought, oh, maybe that's what I'm doing with the children. So I think it began that way.
I love the kind of image that you set of the key and the key and the key, and you can almost hear that kind of metal clanking turning in your mind when you think about that. And I think when we when we think about Marian Chace's work or some of these other women's work, and when we say the phrase backward, which we don't use anymore, I don't know that people truly understand, right, what that meant in that time. And that image that you just gave of like door closing and locking, door closing, like it's behind so many layers that people were put, and that Marian Chase and you and others chose to unlock those doors one at a time and bring the music and bring the dance and the clapping and the shouting that you mentioned. That's a really beautiful image for us to start with. Thank you.
Yes.
So it sounds like you started speaking a little bit, Janet, around this, what drew you in here. But do you want to elaborate on that any further, of what the draw was into dancing with the children, or how this progressed for you as a career, as a life?
Mm-hmm. It feels very organic. I'm touched by your question, Jacelyn, because I don't know myself in any other way. It's as though I came in with this fierce need to dance, and it seems perhaps because of my own personal history and trauma, that specific trauma, perhaps I just needed to be near people who were unknowing about where they stand, or uncomfortable in their own arrival into this world and how they move through time and space. And again, I appreciate you helping me with the terminology now. It's changing so fast, but I was always interested in those who were taken away and put somewhere, whether it be children or adults, but in my earlier life, it was the children. And I think the autistic children, which really, they came after Marian, my work with Marian. So I feel like Marian really introduced me to the unconscious, the embodied unconscious. And I remember chasing her down the hall between sessions, saying, but what after working with her for a while, I don't know if it was a year or 2 years or how long, but I had this image of me running after and saying, well, what about consciousness? What about consciousness? Of course, I didn't even know what the word meant, I'm sure, but I knew something. She was really inviting something that was invisible to become, through embodiment, visible. And then I had so many questions about, well, do you remember what that man said, or remember what that woman did? Remember that moment and that moment. And at that time, there was not time, and who knows what her questions were, but I realized I had to find out what happened next. For me, I wanted to know more about the person and where this really passionate energy came from that had been locked in the body for so long. So that's when I began to ask more questions that took me away from my work with Marian. So my work was it was the beginning.
And I know that at some point, or I believe at some point, you studied with Mary Whitehouse.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how that relationship was established?
Yes. I think after my work with Marian, then I just started working with any children I could find in a more professional way. I got a college degree, and then in my master's work, I focused more on autistic children. And in that way, I was beginning to have an opportunity to go more deeply into the individual child. And from that work, I had the privilege of filming the work, which turned into the film Looking for Me. But I name that because it's really, even the title of the film, and I should say this now because everything that we're going to talk about probably, I'm very sure, is sourced in my own need to see myself more clearly. I mean, it's incredible that sometimes in this kind of a journey, it's possible to actually serve others and hopefully help. But I know that there was always, and I imagine my colleagues feel the same way, I am looking for my own longing to see clearly what is true. And that was a fire in me that just kept propelling me forward. And so these, for instance, the patients with the people with, in my work with Marian Chase in the mental hospitals, and now I'm afraid to use any of these words because I don't know if they're politically correct anymore.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, my intention was not to correct you when you say backward. My intention was just to acknowledge that people don't know what that means now.
Of course. No, it was fine, but I'm very aware that language is changing so much now in so many genres of our lives that I want to catch up. Anyway, so with the autistic children, I know that I was healing my own inner life through that process, and thank God those children were in need of some kind of experience of being seen. So we made a good team in that way, and in the work with the children who were autistic, I did have an opportunity to begin to study the evolution of embodied consciousness right there. That's where I think it began more consciously for me, how to really follow in that fine detail, which was each of their little mandatory gestures that they had to make, and then how relationship came through that was so healing for me. And it was from that place then I remember finishing that film, and which was part of my doctoral work, not doctoral, master work, and then getting a phone call in the kitchen, my Pittsburgh apartment, saying, we need some women in this national training laboratory program that we're doing this summer. Will you come? It was like a month before it was going to happen, and they were frantically, they needed 2 or 3 more women. So somehow my name was given to somebody. That's another story. And then I went to study with John Weir, not knowing. And that's the phrase really that comes up all the time. I went to work with the children who were autistic, not knowing. I went to I got on an airplane and landed in Bethel, Maine, with all these people. And I'd never been in a group before. And I thought, well, if I'm going to teach groups, I should be in one. I mean, that's how naive I was. And that work with John Weir changed my life. And he had on his team where he was a master psychologist, and he's the one that taught me so much about language. So again, my inquiry in deepening my understanding of embodied consciousness, he's the one that taught me how language is really the bridge from the body to consciousness. He offered us this brilliant way of speaking, really, which had to do with owning everything that we said. So we were just plunged into a study of recognizing projection, judgment, interpretation, and it wasn't allowed. And so much happened there. I felt seen by him in terms of what happened in my own movement experience. That was the first time that I understood what it meant to be seen by another human being, when I was deeply expressive of my most painful inner aspect. I am seen by him from a place of compassion and full embrace, no judgment. Mm-hmm. So usually Mary Whitehouse worked on his team. Mm-hmm. It hadn't been that long, maybe 2 or 3 times she had come, but that year she just received her diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. So mm-hmm. she asked Josie Taylor to do it. So Josie said, hello, I'm going to be the authentic, I think she called it movement in depth, which was Mary's term. I don't think she used the word authentic movement. Anyway, I remember being under a piano. She said, lie down. And I was in this big conference room with a carpet. And I laid down under the piano. And she said, listen or follow the movement or something. And I remember it was just my head turning very slightly. And it was bam. I knew in that moment, this is my way of work. I belong to this. Mm-hmm. And John saw that, and with all that happened in that time with Josie and John, especially with John, and then this story I have told often, probably too often. I'm on my way out. The workshop is over, and he's talking to Mary Whitehouse and hands the phone to me and introduces us. So I'm in the kitchen of this retreat center, old house, and we connect in that way, and we agreed to meet as soon as possible. So I flew back to Pittsburgh, closed my life. There was no question, and flew to Mary and waited in a little hotel down the street for someone to call me and say I could come to her studio. It's about a week of waiting, not knowing, no idea.
There comes that not knowing.
Yeah.
There's so much that you've said so far that I want to tap back into. And I know that I can't go into all of it. We're going to need a follow-up for sure. But one thing I really appreciated you naming is your desire to be seen, and how the work that you provided was also internal work for you yourself in the process. And the fact that you named, you said the word team, that you and the children were a good team. And I really appreciate that, and think that there's something very special about the acknowledgement of being in it together in the process of movement and dance. And I just wanted to highlight and name that you said that, because I don't know that comes to mind for everybody when they're working in practice.
Yes.
Right? And that's really an important part of the work, is to join and to become partners.
Yes, I love you naming this, Jacelyn, because for me, I think if any healing is going to happen for the one who's called the patient or the one who's called the client, there would be healing. This is my experience, for the one with whom they're in relationship, the one who they've trusted their soul to. Mm-hmm. If it's not reciprocal, if I'm not growing, and the gratitude, I mean, this is how I came to know myself, because of this child and this woman and that man. And it's all about the other. I mean, there's so much conversation about how we, for me, this great longing to grow a loving, kind inner witness. Well, for me, the only way that happens is through relationship, is through that longing to not only be seen clearly, because I think that is a requisite for really having the privilege of seeing another clearly. I think this, it's not just one, and of course, I've continued to do my own inner work my whole life, as many of us have. What a privilege. I think of most people in the world, that's not even an option. It's not even a possibility. So this possibility of becoming more conscious, and how that happens, there's this wonderful phrase somewhere in Africa, I don't remember where, that was brought to me, really was a great gift. This phrase, I am because we are. And I would also say, I am because you are. Even in this conversation, you're making it possible for me to wonder about my experience. And then whatever I'm saying is an invitation to you to have your experience. And I think in the West, sometimes we forget, and we think we just have to work so hard on ourselves. Like this, and then it's all of this that really makes this miraculous light, really, that can happen within two or more people. It can happen in a group as well. But I'm going way off on something.
That's okay. I'm enjoying it, and I'm really resonating with it, because I work with people with schizophrenia, and I always say it's such a privilege for them to allow me to be present with them, and that I have learned more about honesty in relationship from people who are experiencing schizophrenia than I've learned from anybody else in my life that I've been in relationship with.
Oh, that's beautiful the way you say that. Yes, exactly that.
Yeah.
And in terms of the inner life, it's just a spectrum. We all have these aspects within us that we might call healthy and not healthy. We all have all of that. And so I love the way you say that, how much we can give to ourselves and each other when we feel safe, which has been a huge, speaking of requisite, in my own work. It's essential that whoever is in my presence feels safe, and that I feel safe. And I'm sure this has come up for you in your work.
Absolutely.
Who are challenged by schizophrenia.
Okay, so you're sitting in a hotel room for a week, you're waiting for a phone call, you finally connect at some point with Mary Whitehouse. Can you share a little bit about your experience in working with or studying with Mary Whitehouse? Before
I meet her, I'm not sure about this memory, but I want to say it. Mary had two best friends, Martha and Malcolm Dana. They were a couple. And at one time, Mary and her two children, and Martha and Malcolm and their children, all lived in a big house. A very unusual kind of merging of two families. And I was being driven by somebody. I think this is the timing, but it wasn't time to meet Mary, but somebody had arranged for me to be picked up and meet, I know what it was, meet the woman who was going to rent me a place to stay. So while I was waiting, maybe it happened like that. Anyway, I'm in a car, in the backseat of a car, and we're coming to that house. maybe this woman was going to pick up something there. I don't remember how all that happened, but I look up and I see a woman leaning out the window, rolling the window out. She had a long braid. And I think that must be Mary Whitehouse. It wasn't Mary Whitehouse. When I'm finally going to the door of her studio, which was a storefront in West Los Angeles, it was Santa Monica. It was a storefront. It was a linoleum floor. It was just an empty space. It wasn't what I've come to understand as a movement studio at all. I didn't care. She opened the door and invited me in. She had short hair. She'd been to the beauty parlor, graying. She was a kind of a strong-looking woman, broad shoulders maybe, or and so it was the opposite of this, kind of image of a blonde braid dropping out of an open window in a second story. And she just invited me to move. And I remember I moved in a way that I'd been waiting for my whole life. It must have gone on and on and on and on and on. And I have no memory of the gestures at all, but of this being unleashed. Of course, I'd been waiting in a hotel room for 7 days or something. So it was I knew I had come to I knew it was correct to be there. And we worked very intensively for, I think, 5 months. It was very short. And we saw each other every day, either for meals or in the studio in solo work. And then she invited me into some group that was ongoing there. And so I saw her a lot. She invited me to Christmas with her children, her daughter. And it was a total immersion.
Was there anything specific about the way that she worked with you or the way that she taught that stands out to you?
Yes, only because, as I've learned in other ways of returning to those experiences, she taught in a way that really was very different from the way that I began to teach when I was working from my own perspective. She was very directive. Stand up, sit down, turn over there, sometimes. But I mean, mostly she would say move and do whatever comes up. But a lot of times sometimes she would come onto the floor. I remember once I was on my back and my legs were up, and she just got up and came over and moved my legs around in a certain way. I remember not liking it, but I loved her. Whatever she was, it was fine. Or she would put music on or ask me to choose music, and I didn't like that either. I found that interfering. And she also, of course, was a Jungian. She was in Jungian analysis herself, and so she was fascinated with the meaning of the gestures and the movement. So she brought a lot of rich interpretive material to my experience. And I remember being so interested and also knowing that there was something else that we had not touched. And I guess those were the three main things: interpretive, directive, and using music. And one thing I loved about her was she was so honest. And she was vulnerable. I mean, here she was, a dancer her entire life and discovering multiple sclerosis. So she was witnessing in the most fine detail, because of her skills as a dancer, of who she was, what was happening to her body, second by second. And I was so touched that she was vulnerable in my presence. And I don't know if that's because of the illness, the newness of the diagnosis, or maybe that was always how she was. But she was strong and vulnerable. And that's pretty amazing. You know, I think any strength that any of us has comes from from our own authentic vulnerability. And she was just modeling that for me in the most beautiful way. And also she was able to say, I can't do this. She so much wanted to write a book, and that's one thing we did a lot. I would come to her and we would tape conversations, and we were trying to find what it was that she wanted to write about. And I wanted so much for that to happen, that book that didn't get written. I wanted so much to help in any way I could. And she would often say, I can't find that place in me today. What a teaching for me. What a teaching. So much of the feminine in that way. Again, not knowing. She was able to say, not now. I don't. That's not accessible now, or let's don't go into that story now. And often she would say, I remember coming back after moving, being completely emptied and almost overwhelmed by the power of what had happened inside me. And she would say, now, what was all of that about? And then we would start to talk about it. And again, I think she was much more involved in interpretation than my own work. It's moved really to the other end of the spectrum from that. But I was fascinated by what she saw. And she talked about herself as an observer. And I think for me, the word witness came later. I think it came from, I think I heard John Weir use that word. He used to give us lectures at night after we had all completely unraveled all day long. Then we'd come to a lecture, and he had, a big piece, those big paper things where they'd flip over papers and drawing. And he would, I think a couple of times I heard him use the word witness, but I don't remember how he used it. And of course, that's become the center of my own inquiry. What is witness consciousness, and how does it evolve out of mover consciousness? How do those become the same because of relationship? And so my own questions kept leading me toward who is the witness, which was, I guess, the title of a very early essay. Another way to say it is, how do we grow a loving and kind inner witness? And I think it begins, of course, by, as it did for me, starting with a loving enough, kind enough outer witness who is not judging what I'm doing. And Mary never judged. Never judged. And I don't even know if there was much projection, interpretation. She had a great gift with that.
Do you have, Janet, a fondest memory about studying dance therapy? And this can be with Mary, or it could be with Marian, or anywhere along the way. But if there's a fond memory that you can share about the process of learning what this was.
Yeah. Well, I know I've talked about this before, but what immediately comes to mind is maybe it was the second dance therapy conference in Baltimore or somewhere in Maryland. And we were at a hotel. There were 12 of us, I think. And my experience is none of us knew what we were doing. Again, the not knowing. And we'd talk all day about what we were doing with kids and adults. And then I don't remember that, but I remember at one night we would go into the bar and there would be musicians or music. I don't even remember which. And we would dance. And really, it's actually emotional and even in saying that now. I loved that.
Mm-hmm.
I loved a group of us young women not knowing what we were doing, loving dancing together. And of course, we all went off and developed just that. You know, even in my own work in the discipline of authentic movement, this last place that we have found that kind of arises out of all the different moments of the development of the inner witness into something somebody called ceremony, which is a group moving and witnessing together, but within the particular shape and tone and way of the discipline of authentic movement. And then that's a specific outcome or version in my lifetime and in my colleagues' work. I know so much less about that, of course, but I've heard one woman talking about sacred dance circles, and I feel like perhaps we've all ended up doing that. We started dancing in a bar, and we've all ended up in a circle, dancing somewhere or moving in relationship. In ceremony, it's with a strong enough, a loving enough inner witness. So each one is responsible for their own presence and clarity. And I imagine there are also in other ways that my colleagues gather with others and move and dance. There's a similar way of shared understanding of how that is safe and how it can happen in such an authentic way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that's best memory.
I love that you share that, because I don't know if you go to ADTA conferences anymore, if you've been to one recently, but anyone, now I will say, I can't speak for everyone, but many will say that the best part of the conference is the dance floor at the party.
Yes.
Right? And there's something so, I love that it started in the bars at that one of the first conferences, and that tradition and that collection of moving bodies continues today.
Exactly.
Right? There's so much healing that goes on in that space that it does make, fondest memories, even that being together in a way that is so genuine and authentic and nonverbal and filled with joy and pain and everything together.
And recognition of each other. It's so beautiful. I love hearing that you're still doing that. It maybe the 10 years or whatever it was that I went to conferences, that was we always insisted on that and planning them. And it was always a central part. And there's a moment of a kind of freedom in that recognition. It's dramatically different from moving alone, of course.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I think now on the planet, without this, it is so unlikely that we're going to find our way for our species to survive without this learning how to see and be seen. And, in moments of sorrow, but also in moments of joy, which is so much of our shared memories, yours and mine right now, in these fabulous gatherings of just dancing, and all the words fall away, and all of the more linear attempts to have a good conference, even just dance.
This next question, Janet, is quite a large one, so I'm going to ask you to kind of consolidate it. I know it's a tricky one for some, and I'm interested in the eyes of Marian Chase and Trudy Shoup and Mary Whitehouse and all of the women who studied or created the practice of dance therapy as a profession in America. I'm interested in what the essence of dance therapy is. So thinking of perhaps Mary Whitehouse, what would you say the essence of dance therapy, and I know she didn't call it dance therapy, but the essence is of her practice as you understood it from her?
Well, what I learned from her was what embodied consciousness can be. So that's a very brief answer, but maybe that's enough. I loved her wonder. Again, what happened? What is this? Rather than, and so I think for her, again, I don't think she thought of herself as a dance therapist, but I think she was, rather than trying to teach people how to move in a way that would help with their alignment, for instance, or be good for them, or all of those more linear intentions, which can be beautiful and loving and kind and very helpful. I think her way was much more out around the edges of where the unconscious and consciousness can meet because of the body moving in the presence of another in a situation that is safe, boundaried. And of course, I knew her at the end of her life. This is a time often as we all get older that there's even an increased amount of wonder and not knowing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in this conversation, I am reminded of how much she taught me about not knowing, even though for her, the mythology of story and the beauty of what fantasy and imagination and all that can be, all of that was her way of working perhaps with not knowing. And because of the privilege of working with her, I then had the freedom to find my own way, which came, as I said, through an absence of knowing. Actually, direct experience is ineffable. There is nothing to know. Mm-hmm. It's because language is symbolic. It doesn't even work to respond with language, though we try to, in order to stay connected, in order to not feel so alone, of course. So I think her contribution to me would be very much, and that's, I can't speak for others. Again, I came so late in her career. Mm-hmm. She had this look in her eyes that was all about wonder. Mm-hmm. I can see it now as we're speaking. She was willing to not know.
Well, that's really powerful, because that's talk about authenticity, right? The willingness to not know can be a terrifying place to exist for many of us.
Exactly. Well said, Jacelyn. Exactly that. And look at our world now. Look how much comes from fear. I think it always does for us humans, but seems to be escalating, accelerating. And do we have enough privilege, practice to be held in for me, it's the pelvis, the bowl. May it be strong enough, may it be flexible enough, may it be welcoming enough to hold even this. That would be the voice of my inner witness. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we talked earlier a little bit about shifting language, shifting practice, things like that, and shifting world that we live in. And what would you like, knowing this shift is happening, what would you like to see carried into the future of the practice of dance therapy an authentic movement, or in those movement kind of based practices, what do you want to see held on to and carried forth?
Our first responsibility is to continue to do our own inner work. Mm-hmm. It's in some ways sounds antithetical. We want to run out and help everyone, let's say. But I think the first task is to continue to grow our own inner witness more and more and more loving, so that authentic compassion is a place from which we can exist without any assumptions about what anyone needs. I think the more compassionate we can become, the better we can listen. Mm-hmm. I think it was Simone Weil who said somewhere something about attention is the most precious, the most generous act. By being ready and able to be as we are with a loving enough inner witness, my prayer might be, may I be ready to see what I'm ready to see, know what I'm ready to know, hear what I'm ready, not to offer compassion, but to be a compassionate enough presence. And I think that requires a kind of attention, which in itself is a generous act, as Viola was saying. Mm. And I also think, of course, we're in a time of enormous transition, so much destabilization in every walk of life. So again, I think transition, maybe we're always in transition, probably as human beings, but it feels like sometimes that process is heightened. And I feel right now, speaking of not knowing, where are we now? All I know to do and is to be as I am, and may my presence emanate a kind of compassion that then embraces whatever is true, even this, whatever is true, without judging, blaming, interpreting, projecting, definitely. Yeah. May I be as I am, and may that presence be compassionate enough to hold what is true.
And in order to be enough to hold what is true, we do need to tap into ourselves to make sure that we're attending to whatever it is that needs to be seen and witnessed within ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm glad that you added that in. I think it's an important thing to carry on that doesn't get enough attention in conversation sometimes.
Yes. I think we get confused, like, do your work and then go out and help people, because of what you've learned and what you know. But to me, that's very Western, very much of the patriarchy, very linear. Mm-hmm. The feminine aspect is so much more of a web. It's like this. It includes everything, shadow and light, which means my shadow and my light. I'm never exempt just because I'm one person and I think I've finished up in terms of my own well-being. It's an infinite process, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And again, it's a privilege, oh my goodness, to even be able to choose to try to stay committed to our own practice.
Mm-hmm. So thinking of your practice, Janet, is there a particular client experience that was meaningful to you that you can share with us?
The privilege, again, of sitting on the side of the space in an empty studio and making eye contact with one person or many and witnessing them turn or walk backward or crawl or roll or bang around the walls until they close their eyes and wait and listen and trust and not trust and whatever happens. I would actually say that's the moment. Instead of, because there have just been so many. What I wanted to say is every moment of that kind of shared commitment, like, okay, you be the mover, I'll be the witness. Let's go through these pillars of this, like, opening this portal called eye contact. Let's acknowledge and honor each other. And now, may you feel safe enough to close your eyes in my presence. May you trust me enough to do that. That moment of eye contact before we each go into our inner experience, and then you come back through that same portal and we make that eye contact. That's the moment I would name the eye contact. It's such an honoring of the other, not even knowing who it is. I mean, so many people have come through my studio. Of course, the first day, I haven't met them and they haven't met me. You know, for 50 years, all those people, and then there comes this moment when we each descend in the presence of each other, two different tasks. But the witness is also committed to tracking her own experience as she's witnessing the mover. She's not some mover specialist who knows what all that movement is. I mean, that's also the best. I never know, ever. Even if I've worked with someone a long, long time, I never know what we're stepping into. And that mystery of not knowing, again, is compelling for me. So I think it's the eye contact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be the most profound moment, of course, in a relationship when you finally connect in that way of just gaze.
Yeah. And then the return, it's just as like, oh my goodness, here we are now. And you have just been on this journey, and I have just been on this journey because of you, my mover. Amazing.
Amazing. Yes. As we come towards the end of our time together, Janet, is there anything that you'd like to share that I've not asked about?
I would like to express my gratitude to you, Jacelyn.
Of course.
Because we're all getting older and we're all forgetting things. And I feel the timing for me as I watch my own brain changing, in speaking of transition, into this next chapter of my life called old age or elderhood, or so many different words for it. I feel very grateful to you for, as I'm turning or being turned into this next chapter of my life. And I imagine my colleagues feel the same way. Thank you for saying, wait, is there anything you want to tell us? You know, because now it's our turn, your turn, to be offering from your own developing perspective. And so you and I have never met before this conversation, but I feel so interested in what your developing perspective is as a dance therapist in your work with people who are suffering from schizophrenia, and what you are learning and what your questions are. It's like, it's your turn, and you're pausing and saying, wait, is there anything you want us to know? Again, it's so non-Western. It's so much more the lineage of so many of us following this need to be so deeply engaged in embodied consciousness through all of these different ways, and because of relationship. So I'm grateful to you. This is a huge project you're doing, and I feel honored to be included and grateful for, I can't even imagine how much work for you and whoever is working with you. I hope someone's helping you.
I do have a team. Yes, I can't possibly do this alone, but it's been an honor for me to have these conversations, and I am a lover of storytelling and narration and sharing and sitting together and history and all of just knowledge and wisdom. I just am a lifelong learner, and I think all of these things meet together in this space. And I love dance therapy, of course. And so this is a place of those things meeting. And it's just been an extraordinary honor for me to sit with each of you that I've spoken with so far. Dr. Janet Adler, I cannot thank you enough for your time and your sharing and your stories and your wisdom and the warmth that you brought to this and the authenticity. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jacelyn. Thank you again for the invitation.